Hello, and welcome to episode 10 of Blue Leadership with your host, Dennis Nayor. Dennis is a 25-year law enforcement veteran and a retired chief from the state of New York. He's also a proud graduate of the 240th session of the FBI National Academy and the 61st session of the FBI Leda Command Institute. The Blue Leadership video podcast is brought to you by the nationally ranked Master of Science in Law Enforcement and Public Safety Leadership program at the University of San Diego. You can learn more about the LEPSL program at criminaljustice.sandiego.edu. And with that, I will kick things over to your host to introduce our featured guest. Thanks, everyone.
Kylie, thank you. Great to be back. And today's guest is going to bring a lot to this podcast series. We have Jinx Jenkins. Jinx is a retired colonel from the United States Marine Corps, served for 28 years. He commanded upwards of 4,000 troops and managed budgets of $190 million. He's a pilot. He was a director of some of their largest units within the Marine Corps. He's a faculty member here at the University of San Diego in the LEPSL program. And he's also a founder and CEO of his own leadership company, Integris. So without further, which I can go on for quite a while, Jinx, thanks for being here.
Hey, it's my pleasure, Dennis. Thanks for having me.
We'll get right into it. You know, one of the things that people join the law enforcement and public safety leadership program because they want to be better leaders. They're already at the upper echelon of their agency, but they're the ones that are likely going to step up to the very top position, or if they are at the top position, they're going to just need every tool in their toolbox to be able to lead in these trying times. So I guess my first question is, in leadership, you know, obviously there's some that are just natural leaders and some that it takes a little more time. For yourself, with all you've accomplished and owning your own leadership company, were you always a natural leader, or was it something that evolved over your time in the Marine Corps?
Wow. I would say, Dennis, that my parents gave me some tools that certainly helped in certain ways with my leadership growing up, and early life experiences. I'm in sports, in school, where I think what I would call some first level leadership traits. I don't want to say natural, but that I developed them fairly early, and comfortable with physical discomfort, relatively calm in the face of things not going well, a work ethic. But I think the Marine Corps from day one really drove into our heads that there's not really any such thing as a natural leader. And some of those traits I just mentioned are maybe really good for being a leader in the Marine Corps or in law enforcement, and maybe not so good, maybe even detrimental when you're talking about other organizations. So, I think leaders too have to figure out what their organization needs from them and adapt to meet the needs of their organization to be good. And so, when I think about the formal training that I received coming up, and then the kind of just experiences that I had growing up in the Marine Corps, things like learning to listen, learning to delegate, being intentionally creative, setting long-term goals, and then intermediate steps to get to those goals. Those are all things that I did not naturally do. And I really had to be taught how to do and how to think like that. And so I really think that anybody can, do those, learn those same habits, learn those same skills, and we can all get better at our leadership, no matter what role we're in.
So it almost seems that if someone really wants to, and they can only choose one factor to have as, or a quality or trait, it would be discipline, because it seems that having the level of discipline to learn and to have that growth-oriented mindset is going to be crucial for those who may not have those natural assets.
I think that's a great one, Dennis. It's always hard to come up with just one. Another one that one of my old bosses used to say was curiosity. and just, a constant willingness and to learn and to seek new information and new data and use that to make things better. And that's a discipline too, like you said. So it's somewhere in there, but yeah, I think that's a good summary.
And that brings us into, getting a higher advanced education is something that definitely requires discipline. And I didn't say that when I gave your bio, but you have 2 master's degrees, one from the Army War College, one from Syracuse University, and you have your undergraduate degree from Cornell University. And obviously those are all amazing institutions. Those are all amazing institutions that each and of themselves would be a feat. So I just want to ask your thoughts on the correlation between higher education and academics and leadership, and where the leadership expands through that education.
So I'm going to come back to, I've only taught 2 classes so far in LEPSL, and I'm going to try and answer that by giving you some impressions of the people I've worked with on those 2 classes. And the first thing I would say when I compare a master's education with what I'll call typical undergrad, which means 18 to 22-year-old fresh out of high school, and when I personally look back on the way I approached education as an 18 to 22-year-old, it was really challenging to me to make it relevant because I didn't have life experience to tie it to, right? And so what I see with the folks that come through LEPSL now, and what I saw with Marines who went through training later in life, I had a lot of Marines that went to college and stayed in, a lot of Marines that got out and went to college, but they all came back and said, man, that experience and the ability to relate these academic concepts to, no kidding, doing things, really made it stick better and really made it feel more relevant. So I think that's really the advantage of these types of programs. The one I did with Syracuse was similar. And in a lot of ways, I think it was more valuable than the Army War College one, just because the War College, they gave me a year to be a student again, which was fantastic. But doing it on my own, very similar to what the LEPSL folks are doing, there's an implied respect because of the discipline, to use your word again, that has to take place for these folks who are working mandatory overtimes and 12-hour shifts and still coming in and doing the reading and doing the writing and doing the discussion boards. And again, I think their ability to talk with each other about relevant experiences that make these theories and concepts more real is really what makes this a fun experience for me, and hopefully for most of the folks I'm working with too.
And I think I know what you're going to say. One of the things I was going to follow up with is how we transfer the students in the LEPSL program, transfer the education. Obviously, they'll walk away with a master's degree from a nationally acclaimed program, but to transfer that to the real world, I think you kind of summarized it in the fact that it becomes relevant and they have life experience. So is that what you would say helps a lot in the transfer of that academic education to the real world?
Yeah, I mean, so trying to remember some of the concepts we just did. So the class I just taught was organizational leadership, and we're talking about the different mental models you could use to describe an organization, right? And, again, if I think of Jim Jenkins as an 18 to 22-year-old trying to learn that, I would have been like, this is silly, right? It doesn't make sense. But once you've worked inside of organizations and seen different leadership styles, it was very easy for those conversations to come around of, oh yeah, I saw this metaphor being used in this situation, which really changed the way we thought about a particular problem. And as soon as I switched the metaphor, maybe with another leader, maybe with just a different similar situation in a different organization, and we looked at the whole problem differently, and we could really see that click of, how those experiences and those theories kind of feed off each other and make it more relevant. And to me, the big thing, I mentioned intentionally being creative, and that was one of the big things I learned at the Army War College is really taking the time to force yourself as a leader to think about how else can I think about this problem, and maybe come up with answers that don't immediately spring to mind, but might be much more effective.
Yeah, and I think that just really ties into when you're a practitioner in the field, and then you're going for that advanced education. It makes you more curious, and it makes you have to be creative because everything has meaning to it. So I think that makes a lot of sense for the listeners and viewers. What I wanted to also ask, we talk, when you look at traits of leaders, and you've seen leaders, and sometimes we learn more or as much from the bad leaders because we know what not to do, and we know we vow we will never do it that way. So if we talk, discipline, curiosity. What do you think, in your opinion, are some other traits that make a great leader?
First of all, I'll make just an observation that I've never heard anybody stand up and say, "Hey, I'm a bad leader." But that is a common theme, is that people say, "Man, I learned a lot of what not to do from certain people." So the things that I remember being told over time, one was, man, if the boss is walking around with a smile on his or her face and looks like he's having fun and happy to be with the people and happy to be doing the things that they're doing, that's really, really infectious, right? And the other way around, if they're miserable and talk about how bad it sucks, then everybody's going to be miserable and be talking about how bad it sucks. So that kind of just baseline attitude of I'm happy to be here is, to me, huge in influencing the way people approach their job and approach their duties. And I think, potentially, and I've learned this from a lot of the students I've had in these first two courses, is it really, in a law enforcement role, it changes your approach to the public, right? And there's been so much written and talked about in that relationship in the last couple of years. But man, if you have officers that are going out and feel like they're under the microscope and on the defensive from step one, they're going to interact very differently with people they meet on the street than people who feel like they have the support and the enthusiasm and the backing of the folks that are a little higher up the chain.
Yeah. One of the things you said, and I thought that was great to hear, that you're right. You never hear someone who's a horrible leader say they're a horrible leader. And I think, people are really starting to understand the value of emotional intelligence at the highest levels of leadership, or at someone who's an effective quality leader. And a lot of that, obviously that emotional intelligence is very broad, but that self-awareness part, if someone understands not what they think they are, but how they're perceived, I think that's huge. And I'm sure that you've seen people that just had no clue that they were just doing things to destroy morale versus improve it. And maybe they're good people, and if they had a clue, they could have maybe righted the ship. Have you seen that?
No, that's a fantastic point. That leads me right into the one I was going to say for number 2, which is humility. And I think there's this natural tension because, for the most part, and maybe back to your first question about natural leadership, we kind of have this ideal sometimes of the leader is so smart and so decisive and so engaged that he or she just says, go do it. And we're off to the races, right? And I think especially as you move up higher in an organization, there's just so much you can't know. And so you have to be willing to listen. You have to be willing to ask questions, be willing to take recommendations. And then, again, kind of back to, hey, back in your people and say, okay, that sounds like a good idea. Let's give that a try. So being humble, listening, being willing to experiment and do those experiments in such a way that we gather meaningful data to help us make decisions down the road.
Yeah, that humility is so important, because it show, if someone has that, then it generally says that they don't have a huge ego, and that ego is really what makes it that they don't listen to the advice of someone who may have a lower rank but is in the trenches and knows what's what. And it also allows them to kind of give up some of their power to allow everyone to have that buy-in. And I would agree. I think humility is such a valued asset, and it's part of that it factor for great leaders.
Yeah, for sure. And then you talked about in the trenches. So to me, that's kind of the last one of the big three, is physical presence matters, right? And I think COVID really has made that come through loud and clear. It's been pretty distressing, I would say, to have some of my students talk about the leadership in their organizations basically abdicate and say, we're working from home, and you guys come in and go on patrol and, work extra hours for the folks who are sick. And man, if you're not willing to just be there and see what's happening, and then share risk when there is risk involved, you're not going to go very far. And again, that's probably a little more relevant in the military and in the law enforcement fields, but I think that matters in any organization. We called it leadership by walking around, or leadership by kicking boxes, of just getting out and seeing what's happening, and you'll learn a lot, and you'll be seen. Your message, your values will be more easily communicated to the organization, and they're just going to feel like you're there to share it with them and not just give orders.
Agreed. And, one of the things that I always thought was, and it aligns exactly with what you said, is that they always saw my SUV in the parking lot, and it was good when it was there at 9 or 10 at night, or it was there when we had some civil unrest going on, even if I wasn't on the front lines, and we had our command center staff with very capable people. Everyone knew the chief is there. And to me,
Yep.
I couldn't in any good conscience not be there. And I think what you just said, I couldn't agree more with. What I wanted to ask is, we talked about the high qualities of leadership, and inversely, what do you think are the obstacles to someone who is wants to be a good leader, but they're not hitting the mark? What do you think some of the biggest obstacles are? Obviously, if humility is a high quality, then arrogance is the opposite. So
Yeah.
you had to come up off the top of your head with a few of the qualities that don't align with good leadership. What would they be?
Well, so I think, the first thing is you do have to want to get better, right? And you hit on that already, with curiosity, with discipline, to accept the fact that you're not perfect, and A, which is true of all of us, and then B, that I still want to get better. So to me, that's the big one. If you're happy with yourself the way you are, however good or bad that is, you're not going anywhere, right?
Agreed.
So just like they say, addicts got to hit bottom and want to change before they're really going to change. I think that's true for everybody in every aspect of your life, whether it's losing weight or living on a budget or being a better leader. It's recognizing that change needs to happen, and then figuring out how you're going to get there. And what else?
There we go, right back to the three: discipline, curiosity, and self-awareness. It's like they're the path forward, and they're also the path to see the obstacles.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think, the only other thing I would say that's not insurmountable, but it's probably one of the biggest hindrances I've seen to people who are very, very smart and very, very capable. But it's just having that wherewithal, that confidence to, when do I make the decision? And then communicating that decision in a way that everybody knows the decision has been made. I've listened to you. Here's the decision, and this is how we're going to do it. And coming across with that in a way that's not just a, do it because I said to do it, but it's because, we've talked about this, we've arrived at this conclusion, this is how we're going to proceed forward. And if that comes across as in any way uncertain, especially when you're talking about the business that these law enforcement folks are in, people will start to hesitate and people will start to lose faith in the leadership. And that doesn't mean not admitting you were wrong, but it still means when you're making a decision, doing it and communicate it very clearly that it is a decision.
Yeah, and it's interesting whether you're talking military, talking law enforcement, talking private sector, the business world. We'll say law enforcement and military specifically, always looked at being on the front lines. You need that courage and confidence when you're responding to those dangerous calls for service. Or when you're in the middle of warfare. But I think once you get to those top leadership where maybe you're removed from the front lines, that courage and confidence is what's desperately needed so that you can stand behind your decisions and know that you didn't make them in a vacuum. And I think if a person has those qualities, add them to the curiosity and the humility and all, I think, you're going to have at least the best chances of a successful leadership within whatever your agency or organization is.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mentors. I've always thought that that's huge, and role models. And, none of us gets where we are without them. Who are yours?
So the guy that always first comes to mind for me is a gentleman named John Davis. Call sign was Dog. And I think, well, first of all, one of his mantras was always happy, never satisfied, which, really stuck with me because you're, again, communicating as a leader, that enthusiasm of being there. I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to be working with you. But man, we can still keep getting better. And to me, that, those four simple words really translated a lot into this kind of constant striving to get better, while at the same time being very supportive, very encouraging, and very enthusiastic about what you're doing. And the other big thing he did for me, he sent me out the Marine Corps when we first started in Iraq in 2003. We were losing a lot of people and a lot of helicopters, and almost none of them were due to people getting shot down by bad guys. Almost all of them were due to pilots making mistakes and crashing aircraft because they thought, I'm in combat, it's different, right? And so he had me put together a little 3-day course that talked about this risk management in a combat environment, and really encouraged me to get outside of military circles to explore how, other people in high risk evolutions dealt with risk in a way that, made it survivable. So one of the guys I had come in and talk was a guy who filmed I don't know if I can say snow porn on Facebook, but he worked for Teton Gravity Research, and all those films you see the guys going down crazy slopes up in Alaska or Europe. And he came and gave an hour talk to a bunch of aviators about how do we, what's the process in this very high risk environment for making sure we don't lose skiers, because if they lose a skier, it's done, right? And so just that idea of going outside of your community, outside of your culture, to look for different solutions or different ways to think about a problem, I really took away from him. The second guy that comes to mind is it was in the same unit. His name was Ray Hondo Fox. And again, around the same time, the Marine Corps was transitioning from basically working off of ships for a short, period of time. So in Iraq, we went in 2003 for about 3 months. And the Marine Corps basically said, okay, we're done. U.S. Army's got it. After about a year, the situation on the ground was changing. The Marine Corps figured out they were going to have to go back. So, and stay there for 6 months, 9 months, years, it turned out being, right? And so at the big level, a huge organizational shift in the way we're approaching our mission. And this school that I was working at the time, General Fox basically said, hey, we've got to change the way this school functions to make sure Marine aviators are ready to go do this, not little in and out small missions, but enduring counterinsurgency type of roles. And with a lot of pushback from inside of the schoolhouse, from the people working for him, and a lot of pushback from Marines outside of that he was supporting, but who didn't really want to do that role, even though it was the role they were going to have to do. Saying you can't do that. You gotta stay the way you were. And he was basically willing to take the risk to say, no, the situation's changed. We've got to change the mission and the way we do business. And I'm going to lead that. And that really, stuck out with me, particularly because of the resistance, the institutional resistance he was facing to make that shift. And so those are probably the two that really stick out for me as mentors.
Yeah, and it seems like both of them, the common theme is they made you grow and think outside what your current process was and just look at things from a different perspective.
Absolutely.
One of the things is, a person can be a great leader, but most leaders, if you're a colonel, there's a general. If you're a police chief, there's a mayor or city manager. And sometimes your ability to be successful, even at your high rank, is impeded. And if we look at right now, what advice could you give to, say, current police chiefs or commanders who, maybe they're working with an absence of some of the essential foundational items they need for success, such as support, resources, and staffing. Those are three essentials that you could be a great leader, but if you don't have them, you're always going to be coming up short or just barely getting by. And right now, obviously, there's just so much changes going on in law enforcement and so much politics involved that don't align with the mission. How would you advise those in leadership to be able to be successful when the things they need aren't provided to them from their mayors, city managers, or whomever?
That's a great question, and I don't know that I'm qualified to ask or answer. In fact, I'm certain I'm not, but I'll throw out a couple of ideas. And again, most of these come from batting these same questions around in the discussion boards in the LEPSL classes I've taught. But so the first thing I would offer is that as you move up in an organization, you really have to move from a position of positional leadership where I'm a sergeant in charge of a shift, or I'm a lieutenant in charge of a division, or I'm a chief in charge of a department, to I'll call it influential leadership, right? But you mentioned mayors, city councils, city managers. You don't have the ability to tell those people, you do this because I told you so. And so that's still leadership, right? To influence those folks in a way that helps you get the things done that they want you to get done. And so, to me, that's really about building a relationship, even if it's painful, even if you disagree on 95% of the things you're talking about, at least working to build that trust. so that when you do go to them and say, here's the resources I need to do what you want me to do, they at least believe that you're giving them the straight answer, right? I think along with that is one of the things I got to do that right at the end of towards the end of my Marine Corps career was do a 2-month advanced management program at the Harvard Business School. And one of the classes we had there that really stuck out for me was a woman who said, you need to decide what you're going to be bad at. And she was talking about it for a company. So her example was, when you walk into a Walmart, you don't expect outstanding customer service, right? Because that's not what Walmart is. Walmart's about getting pretty decent quality, cheap stuff, but you're not going to have a staff that is geared towards making sure your shoes fit just right, or you have just the right color tie or whatever like that, right? So the same idea and we've talked about this a lot in the classes I've had, is as resources shrink, as personnel shrink, to me, one of the things, the Marine Corps dealt with this a lot because we were the smallest service and would get in the trap of trying to do everything. But you really have to go back to those folks and say, based on what I have available, here's what I'm going to do. And more importantly, here's what I'm not going to do. And don't present it in a way that it's a threat, but it's like, basically, Mr. Mayor, Mrs. Mayor, City Council, do you agree with these priorities? Because that's what I'm essentially doing, is setting priorities that I believe are most important for my organization. And if they don't, you have that conversation and agree on what those priorities are and use that, but you're going to not do things, right? And so figuring out what that is and then making sure the organization understands what that is. I'm going to go back to General Fox and the thing I talked about him with shifting the way that school functioned to prepare Marine aviation for these different types of missions. He had to accept a lower quality in what was originally the core mission of that school because we were doing this other training. And he, socialized that with his bosses. And again, not everybody was happy about it, but he basically had the support of the institution because he said, I believe this is more important and these are the priorities we need to set. And then the last one I would say is probably the flip side of that is you have to be very clear on what standards are non-negotiable, right? So we're going to say what we're not going to do, but we're also going to say what is never going to be acceptable. What's that, that core, the heart of the department that brings value to the community that you serve? And how is the behavior and the performance of our officers going to reflect that and make sure that we never, ever lose that, even if we're cutting away all these other things? So, yeah. How's that?
That's great. Yeah, I think every leader, like just what you said, is have that line in the sand that they know these are non-negotiables because they're priorities. And if we're speaking law enforcement, it's because public safety will be negatively affected in a bad way, or safety of the officers will be impeded. So yeah, as I listen to what you said, it's just, what I extract is it's really the relational building, the ability to, have trust and to use a quote that I didn't coin, but to fix a leaking roof before it's raining, to build those relationships, establish that trust, and then have a clear confidence in yourself to put those priorities forward, and then know there's a line and these are the things that we must have. And I think now more than ever, hopefully the viewers and listeners and the leaders in law enforcement are taking in all those concepts you brought forth because they're so necessary right now.
And so I think, I'm able to be a little more emotionally distanced than a lot of you all. And I do want to say, truly appreciate what the law enforcement community does for our country. And in many ways, it's much more important than what the military does because you're there in the communities. But there's a real conversation to be had, right? And of what does the community really want versus what has law enforcement over time evolved to think what they're supposed to do. And we're seeing clearly that those don't always mesh, right? And so I do think it's part of the job of a leader to adjust his organization to fit what the customer wants, to put it in a business term, right? And that customer, when you're, no kidding, paid for by the taxpayers and you're there to serve that community, then we have to keep that ideal of service in mind, even if it means not doing some things that we think we ought to be doing. If the community says, no, we don't really want you doing that anymore, okay. You know, if I'm in that boat, I'm probably saying okay, but I'm also very rapidly starting to gather data that helps me maybe go back to those leaders in 6 months and say, you know what, I think we ought to look at this again, right? But I ought to do that from a position of data and respect and giving an honest try at giving them what they're telling me they want.
Yeah, and I agree, and there's great value in that. And one of the things that did come about in the last year and a half, 2 years is that police agreed there were so many things they were doing as an organization and an entity that really weren't police matters, but they just over time became police matters. And there were people that, whether it's mental health clinicians or social workers, that would be much better suited. And I think that's a great asset that came from, you know, the reimagining of policing across our country. And I like what you just said. You get that data though, and then just show, has it increased the department's ability to do other things, and has it provided for higher safety, and is there more community trust from it? Colonel, everything you said has been just, I think, very relatable for those who are the current leaders and practitioners. And again, whether it's from a high level military standpoint, a business standpoint, public safety standpoint, would you agree, as we close up, that leadership is still leadership, and it's just how you unpackage it?
Yeah, absolutely. And the last thing I would throw out is there's still, and again, I think COVID has made this abundantly clear, that we're all human, and that human aspect of not doing everything over Zoom or over the radio, but, you know, literal physical presence is still hugely important. And I don't think that's going away, no matter what the technology does. It allows us to, you know, you and I are talking to each other from halfway around the world. But it's not the same, right? And so I don't think as leaders we can ever forget the importance of that physical presence. You know, that shared risk to some degree, but more just being there and being part of what's happening inside your organization.
What a great way to close. And I know Kylie's going to come in and close out our session here, but I just want to say, Colonel, thank you so much. I mean, it's an honor having you here. I guarantee that the viewers and listeners really are going to be able to take what you said and incorporate it into their leadership style. So from me to you, thank you very much.
It was my pleasure, Dennis. I had a great time with it. Thanks.
Great. Thank you both so much for your time today. And thank you, viewers, for tuning in. We appreciate you taking the time out of your day to meet the law enforcement heroes and leaders who are a part of the MS LEPSL family. If you'd like to watch previous episodes of Blue Leadership, you can find them on the video tab of our Facebook page or by searching USD Blue Leadership on YouTube. Thanks, everyone, and we will see you all next time.